I want to thank our director, Simon Marsink, for encouraging me to give a lecture, working through some of the ideas that will be explored in the upcoming exhibit. As Melanie mentioned, this talk is something of a preview of the more ambitious social, historical, and theoretical goals of that exhibit. Research for this project on prints has received funding from the Medieval Academy of America and the Baker Nord Center for Humanities at Case Western. And finally, just by way of introduction, I want to mention that although the title might suggest something like a broad overview, really what I want to do is drop anchor in about 3 lines of inquiry, which I think suggests something of the real interest in printed material, works on paper, which are really just now starting to get the attention that they really deserve. So to jump in, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to turn off my video because my connection here isn't extremely powerful, and I want to make sure the PowerPoint comes through clearly. So printed icons in the early Slavic world. In one of the commonest metaphors praising icons, Byzantine theologians from the 7th to the 9th centuries described their viewing experience as stumbling upon, quote, a flowery meadow in full bloom, end quote. In response to such language, scholars over the last few decades have emphasized the importance of sparkling, raising the appeal of metalwork, as well as that most quintessentially Byzantine medium, mosaic. Indeed, color has been viewed as primary to the icon's impact and truth, an idea encapsulated in the saying based on Evgeny Drubetsky and color. That is, if theologians define doctrine in words, then painters and their colleagues employed in other media used pigment. These remarks offer a helpful, if somewhat perplexing, entry point into prints, one of the most intriguing, if little understood media of Orthodox icon making. Now, to offer a bit of background, print began in earnest among Greeks and Slavs in the late 15th and early 16th century. Many emigre Greeks, such as Nikolaos Vlastos, Zacharias Kaliergis, and others, found employment at print shops in Venice, including the famed Aldine print shop. There, they produced books of classical and Byzantine poetry, history, and philosophy for leading scholars and humanists of their day. Over the next series, as workshops hesitantly adopted the medium, beginning in Poland, Lithuania, and Lviv, Kiev, Vilnius, Yashi in Moldavia, and Moscow, among other places, spreading to centers in Pachayev, Serbia, and on Mount Athos in the 17th and 18th century. In a reversal from earlier periods, most of the printers were monks, most of the patrons clergy, and most of the books liturgical. Indeed, in a statistical study of Greek artists from the 18th and 19th century, Philippos Heliou found that of 14 recorded printers, all were clerics. And I don't know of a similar study of Slavic printers, but the anecdotal evidence suggests a similar correlation obtains. In short, print was by and large a clerical medium centered around the spiritual and financial interests of monasteries. These developments impacted the use and perception of icons. Mostly produced in black and white, with occasional ochre, pinks, or greenish blues, prints highlighted the schematic form of a figure or scene. Whether produced by a woodblock, which allowed the printer to achieve a basic level texture and surface differentiation, a much more graphic or linear image, or engraving, which permitted a high level of modeling, shading, and detail. The focus lay on the planar forms and inscription, not on the liveliness or presence of the saint. Resting on a matte surface, the print was little susceptible to enchanting plays of light, as were the glistening tesserae covering mosaics. Prints were highly factual, even documentary at times. A page with a holy image. At the same time as woodblocks and engravings spread widely, a technology for tracing icons and printing their outlined surface was popularized. Described in both Greek and Slavic manuals dating to the 17th to 19th century, the process was closest to a monotype. And I think it's important to mention here that there's no exact parallel for this technology in Western Europe. So the Greeks and the Slavs were really looking to other traditions and differentiating their ways of printing from what they saw as sometimes competing technologies. So in brief, the master cleaned the icon to be printed, traced the major compositional lines with a mixture of lamp soot dissolved in vinegar or garlic juice, then applied a damp sheet of paper to the icon's surface. A more complicated technique involved what Slavic manuals called the Rosak window, or pausnaya okonnica. It consisted of a transparent uterus of a roe from which caviar was harvested, dried into a filmy transparency that was stretched over a wooden frame, revealing the icon below. The transparency could then be traced. Depending on the tackiness of the ink, 3 to 5 prints or so could be made this way. And the word in Slavonic is pechatitsia, or in Dionysius of Forna, to ponatai. The printed image could then be transferred to another page, or a double offset that would have had the same directionality as the original print, or the original panel. Thousands of these prints survive in Eastern European, Russian, and Greek archives, attesting to the popularity of this replicative technology. These works on paper need to be seen in line with, but at times also in conflict with, engravings and woodcuts, and later lithographs. Previous studies of Orthodox prints have tended to sort the works according to language traditions. And I'm just showing you here a representative sample of works that I found most helpful. The scholars I'm showing you have succeeded in bringing a large, varied archive to light, identifying hands and patrons, transcribing inscriptions, underlining technical trends, and tracking down archival documents. However, larger questions remain as to what these various forms of printing change about how we view iconography and how they interacted with one another. Moreover, these national traditions need to be seen within the wider post-Byzantine landscape, one in which artists trained in other countries, fulfilled orders for clients abroad, partnered with printers of other confession, and corresponded in and inscribed their prints in often 2 or 3 languages. In short, this was a highly polyglot, multicultural, diffuse diaspora, stretching across and beyond the Ottoman Eastern Mediterranean. And this fact needs to be kept front of mind. So with that very quick background behind us, I want to sketch several lines of interconnected inquiry. Together, they reveal tensions within the medium of paper and with facets of their creation and reception. All these avenues of questioning derive from one overarching concern, namely, in what relation did print stand to icon painting? This is a major focus of our fall exhibit and hopefully of future projects and publications. So the lines of questioning I'm proposing are threefold. One, how does the division of labor between the artist and engraver square with icon theology? Two, does the cheapness of paper in fact add value to iconography? And three, why did tensions emerge between painters who printed icons based on the method of tracing and those who engraved and made woodcuts? So to begin, section 1, how does the division of labor between the artist and engraver square with icon theology? In late summer 1865, Stanislav Dostoevsky, the son of Dmitry Christoph, a founder of the Samakov School of Painting, was traveling from Shtip in North Macedonia to Bazardzhik, Bulgaria, where he resided. A talented painter, Dostoevsky had trained in Russia, and he fulfilled commissions for a variety of patrons. Stopping by the Osogova Monastery, which lies close to the border with Bulgaria, he made a drawing at the order of the Russian vice-consul in Plovdiv, Nadine Gerov. In a letter to Gerov dated September 27, 1865, Dostoevsky writes, quote, "When I returned through Palanka, I was asked in the Osogova Monastery, which you also visited, according to your order, if I came to make a drawing for a book and to give it to you so that you can send the printing plate of it to Russia, to have prints made there. After the order, and at your request, I went there and made a design of the church and the building. In the four corners, they wanted a miracle to be ever represented. I must sit down now to enlarge it and engrave it with all the details. Firstly, I ask you to tell me what size the print should be, and secondly, what surface I should engrave it on, whether steel or copper, so that I can prepare the original as required." End quote. Not receiving a reply, Dostoevsky wrote again to Gerov on January 5th, 1866. Quote, "Since I have not received an answer from you regarding the size of the print, I have chosen the medium format that you will receive with this letter. At the request of the community, I have also attached 4 miracles of St. Joachim of Osogova, 2 from his life and 2 after his death. I was supported by their old library, which you also saw, and thus you can add something if necessary." End quote. The old library that Dostoevsky mentions was most likely an explanatory or illustrated painter's manual, or podlanik, in which the miracles had been described or even represented. Dostoevsky's print was never realized, but the drawing survives in Sofia, which is what I'm showing you. Remarkably, the inscription on the lower edge states that the artist worked, quote, "from nature," end quote, or snaturi. It reads, quote, "On December 1st, 1865, the Russian painter, the native of Samakov, Stanislav Dostoevsky, drew this from nature," end quote. What exactly did Dostoevsky draw from nature? Well, certainly the church building, which he mentions in his letter to Gerolf. Indeed, the edifice is strikingly disposed, clearly and artfully rendered, and it closely resembles the Catholicon at that time. Dostoevsky's question about the print size shows that he wished to use a drawing as a reference, or to have it used as it in Moscow, not as a pattern for tracing, although the latter was always an option for prints of the same size. His care to select the right surface is also noteworthy, because the ability to work across multiple materials would have been impressive, and he of course mentions copper as well as steel. In turn, his consultation of the place itself and use of textual sources, and his respect for the monks themselves and Gerolf, who he invites to edit the drawing, vividly reveals the balance of interests that converged in a print. This way of working, with an on-site painter making a sketch to be sent to a print shop elsewhere, was typical, and there are many, many, many examples. I won't bore you with an exhaustive list, but they abound. On the other hand, though, there were also closely connected painter-printer teams. One of the most accomplished was that of the Serb Kristofor Jeferovic and the Viennese engraver Thomas Mesmer. For instance, on the engraving of the Eleusa, Mother of God, from 1749, Jeferovic, who signs in Greek as the painter of the Serbs, is said to have made the scadia, or drawing, whereas Mesmer made the character, or engraving. Similar distinctions occur elsewhere. For instance, another print by this pair, the Mother of God, Olympiotissa, with an elaborate Baroque frame and mesmerizing landscape, says the image was devised by Jeferovic, but engraved by Mesmer. While these distinctions are perhaps intuitive, as few painters might be expected to have mastered engraving, they complicate the status of the representation. Whereas buildings are known to have been erected by Western architects in the Slavic world, and we might think of the white stone churches of Vladimir Suzdal as just one example, and book illumination as well, the engraved icon presented unique challenges. In a word, it transformed the icon, the artifact that had been intensely debated by iconophiles and iconoclasts. In short, who is the cause of the engraved icon? Whose labor is beheld in the resulting work? Undoubtedly, Jeferovic had provided the initial impulse, yet Mesmer brought the image into its final form by producing a replicative die. Thereafter, it was disseminated and utilized as an iconic depiction. But then, although Jeferovic signs as the painter of the Serbs, is Mesmer not then, in a sense, also an iconographer? If these questions seem like splitting hairs, they gain in force when we turn to an interlocking set of issues addressed by the Fathers at the Seventh Ecumenical Council in 1787. Inquiring into the role or agency of the painter, the Fathers state that the Holy Tradition has legislated iconography, certainly not once and for all, but by erecting rules. Thus, it is the duty of the painters to serve mainly as a material cause of the icon. In other words, the painter supplies the technical expertise, less the formal and final cause of the composition. In a powerful statement, which is what I'm showing you on the screen, which has been discussed by J.J. Yannius, the Fathers declare, quote, "The making of images is not an heretical innovation of painters, but represents an approved legislation and tradition of the Catholic Church." End quote. Claiming that tradition had furnished trustworthy images, the fathers skirted the objection of iconoclasts, who asserted that painters baselessly and without justification devised iconography, leading the faithful astray. Yet with engraved icons, nearly the opposite holds. If in the iconophile model the painter was passive in the creation of form, but active in its execution, here the painter cum printer is active in its creation, but passive in its realization, as the engraver fashions the matrix. This reversal, manifest on many of Jefferovich's prints with Mesmer, presumably assured viewers that an iconographer lay behind the image, but it is also a bit disconcerting. In sum, one does not quite know who to point to as the origin or cause of the image. Section 2. Does the cheapness of paper in fact add value to iconography? As scholars of print in early modern Europe have observed, print was a ubiquitous form of devotional image. In her study of the Madonna of Forlì, a composite woodcut assembled from several fragments, Lisa Pond points out that santini, or small paper souvenirs, were handed out in mass at ceremonies for miracle-working images. Prints, to be sure, were not in short supply. In 1440, as Pond notes, a merchant in Padua ordered 3,500 prints for such ceremonies. Printed images of the Virgin and other saints were everywhere in mid-15th century Italy, and by the 18th century they would be in the Orthodox world as well, but not without misgivings. In his lithos, or stone, of 1644, Pietro Mihilo, Metropolitan of Kiev, Galicia, and all Rus, casts paper as a lesser image support, a cheap substitute for a sturdy wooden panel. The context was the encroachment of the Greek Catholic Church into Ukraine. While he praised many similarities between Catholics and Orthodox, and even urged the Muscovite Church not to rebaptize converts, Mihilo lamented monasteries of the Catholic Rite that had been filled with, quote, paper images, end quote. For Mihilo, who was a strong supporter of printing, even supplying hardware for a shop in Moldavia, the paper support epitomized the lost glory of monasteries that once were filled with artistic splendors and colorful painting. Seeking to overcome such deficiencies, workshops mitigated the downside of paper by imitating revetments, chasework, bejeweled colors, ornamental lamps hung before icons, etc., as on this Mother of God produced on Mount Athos in the mid-19th century. The idea was to simulate, if faintly, something of the experience of being in the presence of sumptuous material, rather than a flimsy sheet that could be easily torn or spoiled or bleached. The worry over paper as a suitable medium has a continuous tradition. The humble page has been seen as, at best, an indispensable instrument for realizing the completed art object, the workspace of a preparatory drawing, or scadia, that allows room for experiment and slips. Such drawings, in use in architecture and painting, had a lengthy, although difficult to track presence in late Byzantium, dating back to the spread of paper in the 14th and 15th centuries. Paper allowed the artist to model new ideas, to try out arrangements of figures and details before committing them to the board or wall. Likewise, paper was used to document older, prized, or beloved works, and to translate them into an easy-to-transport medium. For instance, one print from the Brotherhood of San Giorgio de Greci in Venice shows St. Nicholas curiously seated, a posture that does not match other images of the saint circulated by the Brotherhood. Chrissa Maltesu has persuasively compared it to a relief carving in the Brotherhood's church. The artistic practice of documenting and transforming in paper objects and other media and bringing them back into the workshop to be consulted is, of course, deeply familiar from the Renaissance West. But the working assumption should not be overlooked. Paper was seen as an incomplete version of the image, a surface after the fact, or halfway to the end, mutable, lacking pigment, of less value, and thus likely to be tossed away. Paper, in a sense, wants and seriousness, and perhaps with few exceptions, it rarely achieved autonomy as an independent work of art, as master drawings and prints by leading artistic circles did in the West. And one might also add here, of course, the cult image like the Madonna of Forli. Besides the fact that it was comparably cheap, paper also led to what we might label overexposure. As Eftim Tomov has written regarding 19th century Bulgarian prints, quote, "The people especially loved and appreciated the graphic representation of images of saints, which they regarded as a kind of cheap, which is to say, affordable icon, and decorated their houses with them." End quote. Paper, seen through this lens, catalyzed the image's prestige as well as its downfall. It made the icon boundlessly familiar and limitlessly available by bringing it into rapid and widespread motion. At the same time, it potentially debased the image through overuse. Thus, even as the graphic structure of prints rendered iconography more accessible, we might say, yet the ubiquity of printed media could lead to a viewing posture that was casual, ill-befitting the somber gaze of the saints. Something of this overfamiliarity is apparent in this Vasnetsov painting, where we see folk lubki for sale beside church iconography, rendered on paper. With little forethought, the sacred representation could be transferred into anyone's hand, eschewing a pious decorum and converting iconography hard-won in the crucible of iconophile debate into something that it should not be, a low-priced mimicry or duplication, a kitsch object, sold less out of honor than other motives. Byzantine theologians absorbed elements of the ancient mystery religions. They held that, to an extent, God and the saints belonged ensconced in the church, concealed, hidden behind veils and barriers, only to be revealed amidst incense with elaborate rituals and crafted script. Or, in tragedy, as when this healed paralytic rescued the Kykiotissa icon on Cyprus from fire and placed it in a pine tree, even daring to lift its holy veil. These acts brought divinity to light, whereas graphic depictions were exposed to the world, dispensed in stalls, and handed out on the streets. This paradox whereby the image both loses and gains in circulation is what we might call an economy of loss. For the French philosopher Georges Bataille, social bonds grow in proportion to the sacrifice of individual members. In a provocative sentence, Bataille writes, quote, "They, i.e. citizens, only communicate when losing a part of themselves," end quote. So we might ask, does the same hold true of icons, foremost citizens of a religious community? Did they lose part of themselves to communicate anew to early modern believers? Icons had long been seen as transcending social affairs, lofty, eternal, anything but ephemeral, and subject to the rents and wounds that Bataille speaks of. Yet by being put into a paper form, which was literally easily rent, the icon became more articulate than ever before. But perhaps it also lost the ability to speak with the voice that it had in a pre-paper world. In short, the icon appeared all-powerful because it was virtually everywhere. But in the view of some hierarchs, it had been diminished. Section 3. Why did tensions emerge between painters who printed icons based on the method of tracing and those who engraved and made woodcuts? The Pimen-Safronoff collection at the Hillender Research Library at Ohio State contains one of the largest collections of prints after traced icons in North America. And just as a sort of plug, lots of these will be on view in our fall exhibit. Safronoff, a highly skilled icon painter, belonged to the Old Believers, a breakaway sect of the Russian Orthodox Church that rejected Westernizing reforms. Compiled over several decades at the beginning of the 20th century, the archive includes prints by fellow students in the workshop of the Old Believer, Gavril Frolov. Frolov was a preeminent Ukrainian master whose father, also an icon painter, had immigrated to Riga in Estonia in the mid-19th century. All were produced in the traditional method described in painters' manuals. As noted above, the painter cleaned an old icon, traced its lines with lampset mixtures, and printed a damp sheet directly off its surface. Then in some cases, he made a double offset. Many of the prints bear signatures of the painters who created them, as well as some form of the verb snyats, or to take off or pull off. This is the same verb used to describe how one takes or snaps a photo, which is a really telling etymological link for how painters thought about the indexicality and precision of the process. Some of the prints in Safronov's archive date to expeditions that Gavril's brother, Tit, took to important icon collections. One of these is a print of Peter's Liberation, which I showed earlier. It was made in the house of Iona Petrovich Yudin in Vitebsk, modern-day Belarus, in 1876. In a note on the reverse, Tit asserts that the copied icon dates to the 15th century, testifying to the Old Believers' fascination with Christian antiquities. Other prints come from influential workshops to which Frolov, Safronoff, and other painters looked for inspiration. One example is a print by the master Dmitry Kuznetsov, who ran a workshop in the Lefortovo district in Moscow. The print shows a mysterious figure of Sophia, or Holy Wisdom. This controversial iconography had been banned by the Synod in 1722, but Old Believers rejected that ruling and continued to paint icons of Sophia. Still other prints preserve imagery from the Kremlin Armory School, which flourished in the late 17th century. This example, a complex allegory of chastity, first appeared in woodcut in Kiev in 1627. It later spread in Old Believer etchings in the 18th century. The inscription at the top provides a brief explanation of the major symbols and the composition. The print was taken by Konon Safonov, whose family resided in Polek, Russia. The Safonovs were among the most revered artistic families. On the reverse, Safonov notes that the pattern belonged to Vasily Vasilyev Korovnikov, an important armory school master of the 1660s and 1670s. Collections of prints collections of prints such as Sophronos, which synthesize various times and places, became common in the 19th century, providing a reference point for masters eager to preserve what they saw as a traditional way to document and replicate iconography. Even after engravings and woodcuts became standard, workshops continued to rely on this cumbersome and potentially damaging technique, understanding it to be a proper, orthodox method. Indeed, disagreements emerged between those who traced their prints and those who engraved and made woodcuts. The latter were seen as westernizing forces, since these media were strongly associated with Italy and Germany. In 1709, Ivan Fyodorovich Zubov, an engraver at the Moscow print yard, published a frontispiece to St. John Chrysostom's commentary on the letters of the Apostle Paul. In the inscription, he provides the source of the image, stating somewhat vaguely that it was engraved after an icon in Constantinople, and that it agrees with the Greek meneon. A compilation of liturgical readings, the meneon included abbreviated saints' lives. Some copies had appendices with physiognomic descriptions of the saints, attributes, and their dress. Thus, Zubov claims truthfulness for his engraving. Zubov's engraving was widely copied, imitated by, among others, Christopher Jeferovich, who dutifully included the full inscription below the saint. Like traced patterns, prints, both engravings and woodcuts, were widely used by painters as a basis for drafting panels. In the meantime, among the earliest engraved Manea icons, with compilations of all the saints, laid out according to the liturgical calendar, were being printed in Moscow. Depicting each saint on his or her feast day, these Orthodox almanacs, as Waldemar de Luga calls them, are the very icons that Zubov alludes to in his inscription. Manea icons date back to copies at St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai in the 11th or 12th century. But books that merged physical descriptions with images only proliferated in the post-Byzantine world, and relatively late at that. They reached full form in the 17th century, when collations appear in Moscow, most notably the so-called Tsar's pattern book, which dates to around 1600. These pattern books assembled images, perhaps drawings, but mostly prints after traced icons, alongside annotations from various sources. Their editors presented the two as a trustworthy database for painters searching out reliable models. In the prefaces to several pattern books, the authors lay claim to the very Manea icons that would be reproduced in Tepchigorsky's engraving. So here I'm showing you a lengthy preface, which I won't read in full, to one example of a pattern book from 1658. And this author claims that the Manea compilation dates back to the time not of St. Catherine's Monastery, but the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, beginning with murals which he says are installed over the 365 altars in the church, one for each day of the year, and that later these were transferred into the Minologion of Basil II, which was this giant manuscript, which is among the most famous in all of Byzantium, and then later to icons in Kiev, Novgorod, and Mount Athos. So entirely fantastical derivation and provenance. The compiler presents the pattern book held in the reader's hand as an invaluable repository to hard-to-locate iconography, Greek images that became scarce after the Ottoman conquest. The underlying idea is that the printed tracings, humble though they might be, in fact preserve iconography set forth and codified in the most illustrious monuments and books from the entirety of the Byzantine Empire. It's no small assertion at all. Shortly thereafter, the Patriarch of Moscow, Joachim, would weigh in on the relative trustworthiness of pattern books in comparison to iconography rendered by engraving and woodcut. In a decretal issued around 1682, Joachim lambasted masters of woodcuts and engravings, conveying clearly how seriously the Muscovite Church took this technology. I don't have time to read his decree in full, but his worries boil down to four main points. First, quality. He accuses printers of lacking skill and knowledge of iconography. Two, reverence. People, he says, hang the icons simply to beautify their rooms and houses, not to honor the saints. Podlaniki, or pattern books. Joachim says that the painters neglect now the podlaniki, instead looking to German prints and adopting Protestant and Catholic image types. Thus, the art of icon painting is neglected, he asserts. And finally, four, tradition. The church fathers long ago instructed icons to be drawn on boards, not on paper, and this choice of medium is specific and should be respected. And that last claim is very intriguing. I don't really have time to kind of unpack its implications, but it's remarkable. It's about the very nature of what icon painting is. In the 18th century, Joachim's rulings were extracted in pattern books, demonstrating that icon painters heeded his words, tacking to the method of making prints after traced icons. Furthermore, regulations against loose-leaf prints issued in 1710 and confiscated collections of prints in the allegedly Western forms from 1731 attest to the lasting impact of his negative opinion, even into the first decades of the synodal period. So, what these sources reveal is that looking in tandem at a religious engraving and a print after a traced icon, viewers in late 17th to 19th century Russia could have seen alternative and even mutually exclusive bases of authority for icon painting. On the one hand, they were both printed media, at least as described by Greek and Slavic technical manuals. But they stood worlds apart in the view of influential hierarchs. In their eyes, the taking of a print directly off the face of a traced icon to be pricked and pounced diverged in spirit from the engravings and woodcuts popularized on Athos and elsewhere. Now, by way of summary, I'll simply say that these themes barely scratch the surface of how prints interacted with icon painting in the early modern world, and how painters adjusted and revised the persuasive force of works on paper. I have not dealt over major issues that previous scholars have dealt with at length. Two of them being, for instance, the relation of prints to the verse of pilgrimage in and across the Ottoman world and the nostalgia of many of those prints. And another being the expansive topic of how painters designed icons and murals after Western prints, which has been a major focus of a lot of previous research. Rather, what I hope to have conveyed is a bit of the far-reaching conceptual interests of these works. And I hope to have shown that while unassuming in appearance, prints of a wide range of forms actually tell us a great deal about the visual concerns and the peculiarities of the same individuals who looked at and adored icons. So with that said, I'll say this will, of course, be explored more in full in our upcoming fall exhibit, but I welcome your questions and feedback, and I'm happy to address any of the images that I showed.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was very interesting. And I'd like to open it up now for questions. Either please put your hand up using the feature under reactions, or you can type it in the chat.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's Raul. I was wondering, most of the examples you've given us are black and white. I was thinking that Lubki are sort of the opposite. They're all color. Is there an economic thing going on? Is it quicker to hand paint? Lubki
Yeah.
than etc.
Yeah. So I guess there are two concerns. One is technical and the other is more aesthetic. So quite simply, techniques for multiple colors was quite late 18th and 19th century. Um, and so those techniques were sort of late in coming to the print game. Of course, there were always rubrications, which add ochre. And you do have this on drawings, some of the Safronov drawings, and you do have later watercolor, but yes, you do have a fair bit as well also in Bulgaria from an aesthetic side, a real interest in sort of pinks and yellows. And Tomov describes this really as sort of enhancing the graphic structure of the image. But yeah, you're quite correct that for the most part, they are black and white, but you do have colored examples. And, I could show you more, but they do exist. I sort of began with sort of black and white as a sort of framing device, so I didn't sort of venture too much into color, which is really a whole another kind of issue. But, yep.
All right, great. And another question here from Dr. Fyodor.
Hi, hello, Justin, and congratulations. It was really very interesting, and I'm happy to see you. We
You as
are we are working on a project of the 18th century Arabic printed material, printed books, and I just wanted to mention that your many languages needs to be enriched with Arabic as well, because in the Arabic printed liturgical books, we have engravings that are influenced and even sometimes printed from wood blocks that originate in Moldavia, in Wallachia, and further north in the Kiev, Pechersk, Lavra. So I look forward to working with you on this. And the other element I wanted to introduce in the discussion is the journal of Paul of Aleppo, the Archdeacon of the Antiochian Church, who visited Eastern Europe and Muscovy in the middle of the 17th century, and has a very long list of icons that he records and describes and compares between cultures. So the ones that he had seen in Damascus and Aleppo, which are of Byzantine influence and post-Byzantine, then he compared with the ones in Constantinople and later in Moldavia and Wallachia and Moscow and Kiev, of course, because he also stayed for a while in the Cossacks' lands, as they were called. So you mentioned Bulgaria and Central Europe, and Valdemar de Luga, who was in Bucharest and told us about the Central European influences on this corpus of engravings. But moving a bit east, you will find the same models, the same preoccupations, and they embraced the models from Eastern Europe and from Orthodoxy in general. This is probably the common denominator of all of this, Orthodoxy. So it was very interesting, and I look forward to reviewing it on YouTube when you will have it there. So congrats.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
There was
Thank you
no
so
real
much,
question, I'm
Professor.
afraid. It was all only comments.
Yeah. Well,
All right.
thank you so much, Professor Fyodorov. I mean, you're absolutely right, and I've read the introduction to your book, so I'm getting into the Arabic material, and it's really rich. And you also have Hebrew on some of these Ukrainian prints as well. So this is on my radar to continue to expand the analyses. So thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you. And Lucille Cormier, and then we also have a question from the chat.
Hi, thank you. I guess I have a very practical question. I was wondering about the tracing of icons and what medium were used. Surely they didn't have fine tracing paper or carbon pencils, and then the process of transferring to permanent paper. Were there concerns about damage to the original icon, and how were those met? You know, how were those taken care of?
Yes, so they actually traced onto the panel itself, so they cleaned it, and then they took a very fine brush and painted over the actual lines. They're actually
Okay, with
repainting
paint.
it, but not with pigment. They're using what they've described as lamp soot mixed with vinegar or some sort of garlic juice. Maybe there are other types of things to distill the carbon in, and then they trace over it. And you can see when they do 3 or 4 different damp sheets, you start to see how the lines become sort of mottled. They're not continuous because obviously your ink starts to wear away, and then they clean it. And so they're actually painting on the icons. And they call this a print technique, and then they sometimes use this to make what I call a double offset. And in Slavonic, they use the terms of perivod and prorisi. So the proris is the sort of retracing, and the perivod is the stamp off of that retracing. Okay. So they're actually using the icon itself as a sort of matrix.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I wondered if if this was ever done with the European illuminated manuscripts. It seems pretty risky business,
Yeah. I honestly don't know, but
I've never heard of it, but
yeah. Print scholars don't know of any comparable technique. I sort of did a pretty thorough combing of the literature and talked to a lot of people, so I haven't found anything. I mean, it's closest to a monotype, but that's an imperfect comparison. But that is what it's close to.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Great, thank you. And another question from the chat: any interaction between Lubbock engravers and these iconographer engravers?
That's a great question. So the short answer is that's a question that I have to explore in the future. I sort of have bracketed Lubki because they have a popular dimension, they have a secular dimension, they have a sort of what scholars have theorized is sort of humor and subversive dimension that doesn't appear much in the strictly religious iconography. That said, I suspect there's parallels. I suspect, especially some of these painters in Samakov, they're not men of the cloth, as I sort of talked about with Heliu's study, where there's he knows of 14 printers and they're all clerics. It's a very clerical medium, but not so necessarily when you get into woodcuts, which are a little bit more popular. But I just simply don't know quite yet about those types of kind of dialogue between specific workshops that are making these things.
All right, well, thank you again for coming. Was there any more questions? I'll look through the gallery quickly. And yes.
I do have a question. Thank you so much, Justin, for this presentation. Totally fascinating. I wanted to ask, excuse me, is there in the discussion and reception of these a distinction between the quality of inks and papers used? Not only is it coming directly from an iconographer or after a sketch made by an iconographer, but is there kind of a mass market quality media materials versus art, sacred, higher quality materials? And a related question: the paper, the paper that this is being used. What are the sources of the papers at this time? Are they coming from particular paper making traditions?
Yeah, so the majority of paper at this time is coming from the Netherlands as well as Venice. You do start to have other paper sources the further you get into the 18th and 19th century, but it's very much Western European paper for the majority of the early period. And of course, like all those traditions, it basically goes from a laid paper source to mainly woven by the late 19th century. And the qualities of paper are just very much dependent upon suppliers. So some of the paper in the Safronov archive, for instance, which is I use as a reference because I've worked with that one very closely, is very high quality, and other forms of the paper are pretty low quality. Which gets to your first question about sort of quality of materials. Definitely in things like the books that I showed you, the Zuboff book, this is very high quality printing, very high quality paper. But you get to some of the material, other material, and the same with Jafarowicz, who's there in Vienna. The Mesmer workshop is very highly respected, or the Colombo print that I showed you, the Mother God of Kikiatis, a very high quality manuscript. But you get to sort of tracings, or you get to maybe prints that don't have a huge run, and the material isn't very high quality, and that just kind of really depends on regional differences. I don't know of any studies actually of the ink. There may be some, but that's a good question. It's something to kind of keep in mind.
Thank you.
Sure.
And I see one more in the chat. Let's see. If the icon has been sealed with oliva or another varnish, it would not be harmed by the carbon paint. So addressing the first or the second question there. Some iconographers even make corrections to their icon painting on the oliva. A sealed icon should not be damaged.
Perfect. So thank you, Father Bembrick, for that clarification. So yeah, if it has been sealed well with a good varnish, then would not hopefully damage it.
And Professor Fedor, do you have another?
I just wanted to add that for paper sources, one of the clues is the watermark. There's a whole science of watermarks and a website with an enormously rich database of watermarks. And you see them moving from scriptoria, where they were used for manuscripts in Western and Central Europe. And then later you find them in the Middle East used for printing, because the same paper could be used also for printed material. And you find the watermarks that were recorded in the major catalogs that you know probably better than me. But that's watermarks is a good clue to look at for source of paper.
Yeah, absolutely right. You have to go to the archives and hold the paper up to light, or have the correct light. But this is something that is possible to know if you're able to travel to all the archives and study the paper in detail.
Wonderful, thank you. And even if you're not able to travel to all the archives, please do travel to the Icon Museum to see this exhibit, and don't wait till then. Please come before then. We thank you so much for your participation in today's lecture, and thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.